You didn't find this by accident, and you're not here to be entertained. This is an interruption, because what you've been calling struggle was never meant to be your permanent language. What you've been calling delay was never proof of disqualification. And what you've been calling exhaustion is not a personal failure. It is ancestral pressure pressing against a seal that was meant to open through you. Stop striving for what was already assigned. There is a reason your life feels heavier than it should. A reason certain battles repeat no matter how much you evolve. A reason you carry wisdom you were never formally taught, grief you cannot fully trace, and a sense of responsibility that arrived before confidence did. You are not imagining this. You are standing at the convergence point of a lineage. Generational favor is not mythology. It is stored memory. It is divine advantage carried quietly through bloodlines, waiting for one soul with enough awareness to recognize it and enough courage to receive it. That soul is not chosen because it is special. It is chosen because it is willing. Willing to see what others avoided. Willing to feel what others suppressed. Willing to heal what others normalized. That's why your life refuses to remain small. That's why surface solutions never satisfy you. That's why success without meaning feels hollow in your chest. You are not here merely to succeed. You are here to unlock. There are gifts buried beneath your name, strengths encoded before you were born, favor assigned not to your personality, but to your position in the line. And until this moment, you were taught to earn what was meant to be inherited. That ends now. This is not about belief. This is about recognition. Because once ancestral favor is seen, it cannot be unseen. Once inheritance is remembered, it begins to move. And once it moves, your life will no longer respond to effort alone, but to alignment. You were meant to hear this, and nothing in your lineage will remain the same after you do. You felt it at the end of the interruption. That weight in your chest, not fear recognition, because when inheritance is named, something older than memory stirs, and that stirring is not random. Being chosen was never about exclusion. It was about placement. You were positioned in your lineage the way a keystone is placed in an arch, not admired, not ornamental, but necessary for structural change. Remove it and nothing holds. Place it correctly and the entire weight redistributes. That's why your life never followed the clean lines you were promised. That's why ease always felt delayed. That's why comfort slipped through your fingers just when it seemed earned. You weren't failing at life. You were being appointed within it. Chosen does not mean elevated above others. It means entrusted beyond them. And no one is entrusted without first being tested by pressure they didn't ask for. You were born into a line that carried unfinished business, unspoken grief, deferred courage, talents muted by survival. Blessings paused because no one had the internal capacity to hold them without distortion. So the calling didn't arrive as a crown, it arrived as friction. That persistent sense that something is off, that your reactions feel bigger than the moment, that your emotions echo deeper than your personal story should justify. That's not instability. That's lineage memory pressing forward. You feel compelled to break patterns you didn't create, to question beliefs everyone else obeys, to heal dynamics you didn't start, and you wondered why it had to be you. Because chosen does not ask for permission, it recognizes availability. Availability to see, availability to feel, availability to carry awareness where others numbed out. That is the true mark. Not talent, not charisma, not public affirmation, but an internal refusal to continue unconsciously. That's why your calling doesn't feel loud. It feels heavy. It feels intimate. It feels unavoidable. You didn't wake up one day deciding to heal generations. You woke up realizing you couldn't live, pretending the pain wasn't there. That realization is not common, and it is never accidental. Your lineage selected a moment when awareness could survive without collapse, when sensitivity could coexist with strength, when truth could be held without destruction. So the appointment passed quietly through blood and time until it reached you. That's why escape fantasies never fully satisfied you, why reinvention still carried echoes, why running only reshaped the pattern instead of ending it. You were never meant to outrun the lineage, you were meant to meet it. And this is the part no one told you: chosen ones often feel the least qualified, because ego would corrupt the assignment. Doubt keeps you listening, humility keeps you grounded, pressure keeps you awake. You questioned yourself not because you were wrong, but because you were careful with something sacred. And now the question shifts. Not why me, but will I accept the placement? Because recognition is the first seal, responsibility is the second. Once you understand that your life is positioned, not cursed, the story changes tone. The struggle gains context. The wounds gain meaning, and the calling stops being abstract. In the next movement, we go deeper, not into destiny, but into the subtle signals that have been guiding you all along. The signs you felt but never fully trusted. The call you didn't invent but couldn't silence. You didn't arrive here curious. You arrived here familiar, because the moment you accepted placement, the signal sharpened. And what sharpened was not noise, it was the call you never authored. You have felt it in patterns, not announcements. In repetition, not revelation. In the quiet insistence that returns no matter how often you try to outgrow it. That calling didn't shout because it didn't need to. It lived inside your nervous system long before language caught up. You noticed it when certain conversations drained you instantly, while others made time disappear. When your body reacted before your mind had an opinion. When you felt responsible for emotional climates you didn't create yet somehow stabilized without effort. Those weren't personality quirks. They were signals. The call does not arrive as ambition. It arrives as gravity. You were pulled toward depth when others skimmed, toward meaning when others chased relief, toward truth even when it complicated your life. And you tried to rationalize it. You told yourself you were sensitive. You told yourself you were overthinking. You told yourself everyone feels this way, but they don't. Most people feel discomfort and move away. You felt discomfort and moved closer. Most people inherit patterns and call them normal. You inherited patterns and questioned their origin. That impulse to interrupt the unconscious is not learned. It is remembered. Your calling surfaced through contradiction. You wanted peace, yet conflict followed you. You wanted simplicity, yet complexity kept finding you. You wanted rest, yet responsibility kept knocking. Not because you were doing something wrong, but because avoidance would have delayed the assignment. The call comes through pressure, because pressure reveals readiness. It shows what collapses and what adapts. It exposes whether awareness will fragment or deepen. That's why your life trained you through emotional intensity, through relational mirroring, through situations that forced self-examination long before it felt fair. You weren't being punished. You were being calibrated, and calibration never feels gentle. You sensed this when success alone didn't satisfy you, when achievements felt hollow without alignment, when applause couldn't quiet the internal unrest. That unrest is not discontent, it is misplacement. Your system knows when it is off assignment. That's why distraction never fully worked, why numbing habits lost their potency, why even joy carried an undercurrent of this isn't all. The call kept returning because it is patient, but it is persistent. It spoke through empathy that bordered on burden, through intuition that arrived without permission, through an inner voice that didn't command but invited and waited. And you resisted it, not out of rebellion, but out of self-protection. Because answering it would mean responsibility. It would mean seeing family dynamics clearly. It would mean naming truths others depend on remaining unspoken. It would mean becoming the interruption. So you delayed. You questioned. You tried to reframe the call as coincidence. But the signal doesn't disappear when ignored. It embeds. It shows up as fatigue without cause, as restlessness without direction, as longing without language. Because what you resist consciously, the lineage presses unconsciously. This is where many turn back. They choose functionality over fulfillment. They choose survival over significance. But you didn't. You kept listening even when you pretended not to. You kept noticing even when you minimized it. You kept feeling even when it cost you comfort. That's how you know this is real. The calling stayed because you stayed capable of hearing it. And now, having named it, the work shifts. Because once the call is recognized, it begins to clarify what it's been pointing toward. Not abstract destiny, not spiritual fantasy, but something far closer, the origin of the struggle itself. In the next movement, we trace the call backward into the generational patterns it's been asking you to confront. Not to blame, not to fix prematurely, but to finally see. You felt it when the call traced backward, that subtle tightening. Because recognition doesn't just illuminate, it exposes. What you're facing didn't begin with you, but it arrived through you. When you look honestly at your struggles, there's a strange familiarity to them, as if they've been rehearsed, as if the script existed before your entrance. The same emotional dead ends, the same relational dynamics, the same cycles of effort followed by inexplicable resistance. And you tried to personalize it. You asked what you were doing wrong. You questioned your discipline, your worth, your decisions. You searched for surface explanations that never fully satisfied, because the source was deeper than behavior. Generational patterns don't announce themselves as history. They masquerade as personality, as temperament, as that's just how our family is. But beneath those phrases live unresolved moments. Moments where survival took precedence over truth, where silence replaced expression, where strength meant endurance instead of healing. Those moments don't disappear when the people pass. They imprint. They move through families as emotional reflexes, as coping mechanisms mistaken for character, as fears inherited without memory of origin, and you inherited awareness alongside them. That's why your reactions felt disproportionate, why certain situations triggered responses that confused even you, why your body seemed to remember things your mind never learned. This isn't weakness. It's sensitivity tuned to unfinished business. Your challenges are not random obstacles. They are signals. Signals pointing to places where the lineage adapted instead of healed, where pain was normalized instead of resolved, where gifts were constrained because expression felt unsafe. You feel this most clearly when you try to move forward and something pulls you back. Not externally, internally. A hesitation without logic, a resistance without explanation. That is not self-sabotage. It is ancestral loyalty. Part of you learned that advancement came with cost, that visibility invited danger, that rest required permission that was never granted. Those beliefs were never spoken to you. They were modeled. And models shape nervous systems long before they shape beliefs. That's why affirmations felt shallow, why willpower alone failed, why thinking positive never touched the core. You were trying to override what needed to be acknowledged. Healing does not begin by rejecting the past. It begins by recognizing its influence. The moment you stop blaming yourself for inherited patterns, clarity emerges. Not absolution, understanding. Understanding that your struggle is intelligent. It's purposeful. It's pointing somewhere specific. And that somewhere is not punishment, it's potential. Every repeated challenge marks an area where the lineage stalled. Every emotional charge highlights a wound asking for witness. Every pattern craving interruption chose you because you could see it without becoming it. This is where responsibility begins to feel heavy, because seeing the pattern removes the excuse of ignorance, and awareness always carries choice. You don't heal by force. You heal by presence, by staying with what others fled, by naming what others avoided, by holding compassion where judgment once ruled. This is not about fixing your ancestors. It's about freeing yourself from carrying what was never yours to complete alone. Once you see the origin of the struggle, something shifts. The problem stops feeling personal, and the solution stops being external. In the next movement, we go deeper, not into wounds, but into what was preserved alongside them. Because where trauma traveled, blessing traveled too. Dormant, waiting. You felt the shift when the struggle stopped being personal. Because once blame dissolves, something else becomes visible. What traveled through your lineage was not only pain. Trauma was never the sole inheritance. It was simply the loudest. Alongside every wound, something else was preserved. Quietly, intentionally. Blessing often hides beneath what looks like limitation, because blessing when unprotected can become dangerous. So it learned to sleep. Spiritual inheritance is not abstract. It functions like memory carried in the body of the line. Strength encoded through survival, wisdom forged through endurance, favor protected by concealment. You were not born empty-handed. You were born sealed. And seals only break under the right conditions. That's why your gifts didn't activate early. Why talent came with friction. Why insight arrived before permission. Your lineage learned when to hide and when to pass on. Not consciously, but instinctively. Spiritual DNA does not guarantee ease. It guarantees capacity. capacity to hold more awareness without fragmentation, capacity to integrate pain without becoming it, capacity to channel favor without distortion. But dormant gifts feel frustrating before they feel empowering. You sensed ability without access, potential without instruction, a knowing without a manual. That gap is intentional. Blessing activates only when the system holding it becomes safe. Safe enough to express without repeating the past. Safe enough to wield without harm. That's why trauma and blessing are braided. One guards the other. You inherited resilience because fragility would not have survived. You inherited intuition because logic alone was insufficient. You inherited depth because surface living would have erased the line. These are not coincidences. They are adaptations that became assets. Your family line did not only endure, it encoded. It stored courage in silence, creativity in constraint, leadership in observation. You see this when you notice how easily you read between lines, how quickly you sense emotional undercurrents, how naturally others bring you what they hide from themselves. Those are not learned skills, they are remembered ones, and they remain dormant not because you were unworthy, but because timing matters. Blessing released too early becomes burden. Favor expressed too soon attracts resistance the system cannot withstand. So it waited until someone emerged with enough consciousness to choose healing over reenactment, enough humility to listen rather than dominate, enough responsibility to carry the gift forward without using it to escape the work. That's when blessing stirs, not as spectacle, as alignment. You begin to notice that what once drained you now informs you. What once overwhelmed you now guides you. What once felt like too much now feels precise. The gift doesn't announce itself, it integrates, and integration is quieter than performance. This is where many misunderstand inheritance. They expect power to feel explosive, but ancestral blessing feels familiar. It feels like finally standing in your natural posture, like breathing without bracing, like speaking without rehearsing survival. The gift was never foreign, it was deferred. Deferred until someone could receive it whole. That someone is not defined by perfection, but by willingness to heal before using what was given. Now that blessing has been named, the question changes again. Not do I have it, but how do I engage it consciously? Because awareness alone does not activate inheritance. Participation does. In the next movement, we move from concept to evidence, from theory to proof written across generations. Because resilience leaves traces, and blessing always leaves witnesses. You felt it when blessing stopped sounding abstract. Because once something feels familiar, you start noticing where it's already been working. Look back at your lineage not through sentiment, but through pattern. There are moments that don't make sense on paper, survivals that defied odds, turns of fortune that arrived without preparation. Those were not accidents. They were breaches. Every family line carries stories that feel strangely protected. Someone who made it out when others didn't. Someone who survived what should have ended them. Someone whose life bent instead of breaking. Those stories aren't nostalgia, they're evidence. Blessing doesn't always look like abundance. Sometimes it looks like preservation, a job lost but a skill awakened, a collapse that forced relocation only to uncover opportunity elsewhere, a breakdown that prevented a worse fate from unfolding. You may have been taught to call these coincidences, but coincidence doesn't repeat with intention. Resilience that echoes across generations is not luck. It is stored favor activating under pressure. Your lineage learned how to adapt without disappearing, how to bend without erasing identity, how to move through constraint without surrendering essence. That's why you notice patterns of survival that feel disproportionate to the resources available. How somehow things worked out just enough. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. Enough to continue, enough to transmit. And you carry that same signature. You've lived through moments where collapse felt inevitable, where logic predicted failure, where support systems were thin or non-existent. Yet you're still here, not untouched but intact. That intactness matters, because favor doesn't remove hardship. It preserves function within it. It keeps something alive that should have gone dormant. It protects the core so it can emerge later with clarity. You see this when you notice how creativity survived scarcity in your family, how humor persisted despite hardship, how intelligence adapted when formal education wasn't accessible. Those are not coping mechanisms alone. They are blessings disguised as strategies. And when someone in the line begins healing consciously, those strategies evolve. What was once survival becomes skill. What was once defense becomes discernment. What was once hiding becomes wisdom. This is where breakthrough stories emerge. Not miracles divorced from effort, but alignment unlocking momentum. Someone decides to face what was avoided, to speak what was silenced, to choose differently where others repeated, and suddenly doors open that were always there but unseen. Not because reality changed, because perception did. Favor amplifies when consciousness aligns with it, when healing removes the distortions that once misused the gift. That's why breakthroughs often feel sudden to outsiders, but to the one experiencing them, they feel overdue, as if something finally caught up. This is the moment many misunderstand again. They think the breakthrough is the goal. It isn't. It's the confirmation. Confirmation that blessing was never absent, only waiting for stewardship. And stewardship demands discernment, because not every gift announces itself loudly. Some reveal themselves through what you can endure without losing self, through what you can transform instead of transmit unchanged. Your resilience is not random. It is inherited capacity meeting awareness. And now that you've seen the evidence, the work sharpens. Because once you recognize favor at work, you are accountable for how it's used. In the next movement, we move from proof to precision, naming the specific strengths you carry, not generically, but distinctly. Because inheritance is not vague, it is tailored. You recognize the proof, and proof changes posture. Because once you see favor at work, you stop asking if you carry something and start asking what exactly has been entrusted to you. Inheritance is never generic, it is specific. Your lineage did not pass down a vague sense of strength. It transmitted particular capacities shaped by what was needed most at critical moments. That's why comparison has always felt wrong to you, why other people's paths never quite fit, why imitation drained instead of inspired. You were never meant to carry someone else's gift. Your blessing announces itself through what comes naturally under pressure, not what looks impressive, but what stabilizes situations others cannot hold. Pay attention to where people turn toward you instinctively, in crisis, in confusion, in moments that require clarity without cruelty. Those patterns are not accidental. They are echoes of how your line survived. Some inherit discernment, the ability to see motives beneath words. Others inherit endurance, the capacity to stay present long after others withdraw. Some inherit mediation, the instinct to translate between worlds that refuse to understand each other. You may have dismissed these as just who I am, but identity often hides assignment. What feels normal to you is often rare to others. That's why you undervalued it. You learned early not to center your strengths because centering them once carried risk. Visibility wasn't safe. Authority wasn't protected. So the gift learned to operate quietly. But quiet does not mean small. Your inherited strengths show up in how you regulate emotional environments, how you sense when something is off before evidence appears, how you adapt without losing integrity. Those are not coping mechanisms alone. They are functions. Functions passed down because they worked. But here is where responsibility sharpens again. A gift unrecognized becomes misused. Discernment becomes suspicion. Endurance becomes self-neglect. Mediation becomes erasure. You've felt this distortion, times when your strength turned against you, when helping depleted you, when caring others cost you yourself. That wasn't the gift failing. It was the gift operating without conscious stewardship. Inheritance must be named to be wielded correctly. Naming clarifies boundaries, clarifies application, clarifies when to engage and when to withdraw. You don't embody ancestral blessing by doing more. You embody it by doing precisely what aligns. This is where many hesitate, because naming your strength feels like claiming authority, and authority carries memory of backlash, rejection, loss. But avoiding authority doesn't dissolve it. It just leaks sideways. Your lineage needs the gift embodied cleanly now, without distortion, without apology, not for recognition, for completion. When you finally name what you carry, something steadies, the inner conflict eases, the overextension quiets, because the gift stops trying to prove itself. And now the path becomes clearer. Once you know what you carry, the question is no longer identity, it becomes engagement. How do you activate this inheritance consciously instead of reactively? How do you partner with what was given rather than being driven by it? That's where we move next, out of recognition and into participation. Because blessing does not activate itself, it responds to invitation. You felt the shift when the gift was named, because naming creates a doorway. What was unconscious now waits for participation. What moved reactively now asks for consent. Activation is not dramatic, it is deliberate. God's generational favor does not respond to force. It responds to alignment. You do not activate inheritance by striving harder. You activate it by making space. Space to listen without rushing to fix. Space to remember without rewriting history. Space to release burdens you were never meant to carry forward. This is where engagement begins, not in performance but in posture. Prayer is not a request for power, it is an act of placement. When you speak with awareness of lineage, you are not reaching upward. Alone, you are standing within a line that already knows how to listen. You acknowledge what came before you without glorifying it. You honor endurance without repeating suffering. You thank survival while choosing healing. That alone shifts something. Meditation is not escape, it is attunement. When you sit with your breath, with your body, with memory that surfaces uninvited, you are signaling safety. And safety is what allows dormant blessing to unseal. Your system must know it will not be forced to relive the past in order to heal it. Intentional reflection does not mean dwelling, it means witnessing. You look at your ancestors not as myths or mistakes, but as humans who adapted with limited options. You acknowledge where they endured brilliantly and where they froze. This acknowledgement breaks unconscious loyalty. You are no longer required to repeat pain in order to honor love. And this is where choice becomes powerful. Breaking curses is not theatrical, it is practical. Every time you respond instead of react, you interrupt transmission. Every time you choose truth over silence, you redirect the line. Every time you rest without guilt, you teach the lineage something new. Blessing amplifies through conscious choice, not because you are superior, but because you are present. Journaling becomes revelation when it is approached as dialogue, not documentation. You write not to vent, but to notice, to trace connections, to name patterns without judgment. Insights surface when you stop trying to control them. You begin to see how certain emotions don't belong to the present moment, how certain fears carry old language, how certain strengths arrive with familiar weight. Writing slows the inheritance down enough to understand it, and understanding restores agency. This is where many retreat, because engagement removes excuses. You can no longer claim ignorance once awareness is active. You can no longer blame fate once choice is visible. Activation costs comfort. It requires discipline without rigidity, consistency without obsession, reverence without fear. You don't engage your inheritance once, you return to it, daily, quietly, intentionally. This is not about perfection, it's about relationship. Relationship with your past without being owned by it. Relationship with your gift without abusing it. Relationship with favor without outsourcing responsibility. Once engagement begins, momentum follows. Not instantly, but unmistakably. And with momentum comes confrontation, because activating blessing exposes what resists it. In the next movement, we address what happens when you stop carrying what was never yours and how breaking patterns you didn't start still requires courage you must supply. You felt it when engagement became real, because the moment you stop carrying unconscious weight-resistant surfaces, not from the outside first, from within. Breaking what you didn't start is not heroic, it is disruptive. It destabilizes familiar systems. It challenges agreements no one remembers making, but everyone depends on. When you choose differently, you don't just heal yourself. You interrupt momentum that was moving without question. That interruption has consequences. You noticed it when clarity created distance, when boundaries were misunderstood as betrayal, when growth was met with silence instead of celebration. This is not punishment, it is recalibration. Systems resist change until they reorganize or fracture. Your lineage learned how to survive through adaptation, not confrontation. So when you stop adapting, the system notices. You may feel guilt for no longer absorbing emotional weight, fear for no longer playing a stabilizing role, grief for versions of connection that required your self-erasure. This is the cost of conscious choice. You are not breaking curses with declarations alone. You are breaking them with consistency. Every time you refuse to reenact a familiar argument, every time you don't rescue at your own expense, every time you speak plainly instead of managing reactions. These moments feel small. They are not, they are thresholds, because the lineage does not change when you understand it. It changes when you behave differently under pressure. That's where courage is required. Not dramatic courage, but sustained courage. The kind that tolerates misunderstanding without reverting, the kind that holds boundaries without explaining endlessly. You will be tempted to soften your clarity, to shrink your truth, to return to roles that once made you feel needed. That temptation is not weakness. It is memory. Memory of when safety depended on compliance, when belonging required silence, when love was conditional on carrying more than your share. But you are no longer operating under those conditions. You are not rejecting your family. You are rejecting the parts of the pattern that required self-abandonment to continue. That distinction matters. And here is the irreversible truth. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unknow it. Once you feel the cost of repetition, you cannot justify it. Once you taste alignment, distortion becomes intolerable. This is the point of no return, not because you are perfect, but because you are awake. Awakening does not make life easier. It makes it honest. And honesty forces choice. You either live from inheritance consciously, or you live reacting to it unconsciously. There is no neutral ground once awareness is active. This is where responsibility crystallizes. You are not required to heal everyone, but you are responsible for not transmitting what you've recognized. You are responsible for your responses, for your boundaries, for how you wield what was entrusted. This is the weight of favor, not entitlement, not exemption, stewardship. And stewardship demands resolve, because the line will test whether you mean it, whether this change is momentary or embodied. In the final movement, we do not inspire. We seal. We define what it means to live as someone who has accepted their inheritance fully and what future generations will receive because you chose not to turn back. You felt it when the path narrowed. Because inheritance once accepted simplifies everything. Not because life becomes easier, but because division ends. There is a difference between knowing who you are and living as who you are. This is that difference. Stepping into your divine inheritance does not make you extraordinary in appearance. It makes you precise in action. You stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. You stop negotiating your boundaries internally. You stop asking permission to embody what was already entrusted. Living as an empowered chosen one is not about intensity. It is about consistency. You carry your ancestral blessings quietly now, in how you choose rest over resentment, in how you respond instead of react, in how you refuse to transmit pain simply because it is familiar. This is embodiment. You don't announce healing. You demonstrate it. You don't argue for favor. You steward it. And stewardship reshapes the future in ways you will never fully witness. Because the greatest impact of your choice will not happen in your lifetime alone. It will show up in children who don't inherit your coping mechanisms, in relationships that don't require self-erasure to survive, in nervous systems that grow up regulated instead of vigilant. You are leaving something cleaner behind you, not perfect, but freer. This is how legacy actually works, not through monuments or stories, but through what no longer needs to be healed. Future generations will never know the names of the battles you fought internally. They will simply live with more access, more ease, more permission to be whole. And that is the mark of generational favor activated correctly. You are not meant to carry this identity loudly. You are meant to carry it faithfully. Because favor does not remove responsibility, it amplifies it. You will be tested not to see if you deserve it, but to see if you will protect it. Protect it from ego. Protect it from exhaustion. Protect it from being diluted into performance. The inheritance does not ask for perfection. It asks for presence. Presence with yourself. Presence with truth. Presence with the cost of choosing differently again and again. This is your blueprint for the future. Live in alignment. Heal before you lead. Respond instead of repeating. And when doubt returns, as it sometimes will, remember this: you were not chosen because you were flawless. You were chosen because you were willing to become conscious. That willingness has already altered the line. Nothing behind you is the same. Nothing ahead of you will be untouched. Stand where you are. Carry what you've been given, and let the inheritance continue cleanly, quietly, and fully embodied through you. This is where the voice softens, but the truth does not. Because after everything that has been revealed, nothing more needs to be added. Only remembered, you didn't arrive at this moment by willpower. You arrived because something ancient recognized you as safe enough to awaken. And now the work is quieter. No announcements, no proving, no chasing signs. Just alignment lived daily. You will notice that the urgency fades, but the clarity stays. That the need for validation loosens, but the responsibility remains. That the hunger to be seen transforms into a commitment to see clearly. This is how you know the inheritance has settled. You are no longer searching for confirmation. You are moving with discernment. And when confusion appears again, as it will, you will not panic. You will pause. You will listen. You will remember where the weight actually belongs. Because you are no longer carrying the past blindly. You are carrying it consciously. Some days this will feel ordinary, almost anticlimactic, and that is a sign of success. Ancestral blessing does not keep you in constant intensity. It stabilizes you into truth. It gives you permission to live without bracing, to love without fixing, to lead without dominating. It teaches you that rest is not betrayal, that boundaries are not abandonment, and that silence can be sacred rather than avoidant. You may still grieve what was lost before you arrived, what could have been healed sooner, what pain did not need to be passed down. Let that grief move through you. Grief is not doubt, it is honor. Honor for the cost paid to get here. Honor for the line that endured long enough to produce you. Honor for the future that will feel lighter because you chose differently. And when you stand in that honor, something settles even deeper. You realize you were never meant to carry this alone. Not because others will understand, but because you are supported by something larger than comprehension. By favor that moves quietly. By guidance that does not rush. By a lineage that finally gets to rest through you. This is not an ending. It is a stabilization. You do not need to rush forward. You do not need to look back. Just stand where you are with awareness, with humility, with resolve. Let your life speak what your mouth no longer needs to announce. And when the next generation asks why things feel different, why peace seems more accessible, why wholeness feels less complicated, they will not know your name as the reason, but the line will know. And that is enough.